Sarah had lived alone on that dusty stretch of Arizona territory for nearly a year, her days filled with the quiet ache of loss. She moved through her routines like a shadow, feeding the hens, hauling water, mending fences, always with the weight of an empty cradle echoing through the small cabin she once called a home of hope. When she first saw the Apache warrior stumbling toward her property, her breath caught. His steps were uneven, his shoulders shaking from fatigue, yet his arms held the infant with astonishing care. Sarah's pulse raced. Lone riders meant danger, but this man's desperation carried something different. Fear, but not of her. Fear for the child. He stopped a few feet from her porch, chest heaving, his dark eyes burning with a plea she didn't need translated. He shifted his grip on the infant and extended the baby forward, palms open. Sarah hesitated only a moment. The boy's tiny wail pierced the silent desert air. Her heart broke wide open. When she took the infant into her arms, she felt how light he was, far too light. His cheek rested against her collarbone, fever warm. She felt her breath tremble as the warrior bowed his head, his braids hanging like dark ropes over his shoulders, sweat and dust streaking his face. Gratitude radiated from him so fiercely it almost shamed her. Inside the cabin, Sarah sat in the chair she once used to rock her own child. The memory stung, but her body responded instinctively as she brought the infant close. The moment he latched, weak but determined, tears blurred her vision. Life, fragile, hungry, trusting, pressed against her once more, and something inside her awakened. The warrior stood in the doorway, unsure whether to step inside or remain at the threshold. His hands hovered at his sides, trembling slightly. He watched the infant feed, and his expression shifted from terror to profound relief. He whispered something low in Apache, soft, reverent, like a prayer carried on the desert wind. Sarah didn't understand his words, but she understood his heart. She nodded gently to reassure him. His breath released shakily, like a man pulled back from the edge of a cliff. He placed a small pouch beside her door, dried berries, maybe a humble offering, before lowering himself to sit by the porch, exhausted beyond measure. The infant finished feeding and curled into her chest, finally settling into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in days. Sarah felt warmth bloom in her chest, not just physical, but emotional, deep, and startling. She pressed her cheek to the top of his tiny head and inhaled the faint scent of smoke and desert. It reminded her of life's fragility, of how loss and hope often walked side by side. After a long while, Sarah stepped outside. The warrior rose abruptly, unsure of her intentions. She offered him a cup of water. He accepted it with both hands, honoring it like a sacred gift. Their eyes met, not as enemies, not even as strangers, but as two people bound by the same fierce need.
To protect a child who had no one else. He tried to speak, gesturing toward the child, toward the distant mesas, then toward the sky. Sarah watched him carefully, piecing together meaning without a single shared word. She saw grief in the way his shoulders slumped, saw fear in the tightness of his jaw, saw responsibility weighing on him like an anvil. She understood what he could not say. The baby's mother was gone, and he had nowhere safe to take his son. The evening sun dipped low, painting the desert gold. Sarah invited him inside with a gentle motion. He followed, cautious but trusting. In the small cabin, he looked at the baby, then at Sarah, and placed a hand over his heart. His voice cracked as he spoke the child's name. Dakota, Sarah repeated it softly. His eyes softened. She laid Dakota in a small basket lined with cloth. The baby slept soundly, little chest rising and falling. The warrior exhaled in relief. He sat on the floor beside the basket, refusing to be far from his son. Sarah watched him and saw not a warrior feared by townsfolk, not a threat the newspapers warned about, but a father terrified of losing the last piece of his family. Night settled around the cabin, the desert wind whispering through the cracks in the walls. Sarah lit the lamp, its soft glow wrapping them in fragile warmth. She prepared simple food, offering some to the warrior. He accepted a small amount, eating only when she nodded that it was all right. Every movement he made was gentle, respectful, mindful of her space. Hours passed in quiet understanding. Sarah's grief felt less sharp in the presence of this determined father and his vulnerable child. She realized she had not felt this kind of purpose since her own baby had been alive. Dakota stirred in the basket, fussing softly. Sarah lifted him again, and as she cradled him, the warrior watched her with eyes full of both gratitude and sorrow. She rocked Dakota gently, humming a lullaby she hadn't sung in months. The warrior listened, a strange calm settling over him. For the first time since arriving, he looked like a man allowed to breathe. Sarah felt something shift, something unspoken, something delicate, something hopeful. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment their lives intertwined. Outside, coyotes howled distantly. The warrior rose and closed the door to keep out the chill, then sat again near the basket. Sarah watched him and realized this man had carried despair for many miles, seeking help from the only soul he believed wouldn't turn him away. She felt honored by his trust, honored and humbled. As dawn approached, Dakota slept deeply, tiny fists resting against his cheeks. The warrior bowed his head near the basket, whispering again in Apache. Sarah stroked the baby's back, her heart full with something she thought she'd lost forever. She didn't know why this warrior had chosen her doorstep, or what dangers he faced, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not let this child die. Not while she still had breath. When morning light seeped through the window, the warrior stood and looked at Sarah as if searching for an answer. She nodded slowly, reassuring him that Dakota was safe with her. His shoulders relaxed. For the first time, a faint, tired smile crossed his face, a smile filled with gratitude deeper than any words they could ever share. They were strangers, they were from different worlds. But through the fragile life of a starving baby, fate had bound them together, mother, father, and child on a land where survival meant depending on the unexpected mercy of others. And mercy that night had found them both. The days slipped by with a quiet rhythm, neither of them planned but both needed. The warrior arrived at sunrise or dusk, never staying long, but long enough to see Dakota fed, warm, and safe. Each time he appeared, Sarah felt the tension in her chest ease. She no longer lived alone in silence. He brought what he could: a bundle of juniper berries, a strip of deer hide, a carved rattle for Dakota. They were humble gifts, but they meant more than coin. They were offerings from a father doing everything in his power to repay the woman who kept his son alive. Sarah accepted each one gently. Dakota thrived under her care. His cheeks rounded, his cries grew stronger, and his eyes began to follow the light in the room. Sarah felt something within her heal with every breath he took. She'd thought her heart had stopped growing the day she buried her own child. Yet here she was, being pulled back to life. The warrior watched her with a softness that surprised them both. Though his words were few, his presence spoke louder than any language. He fixed her broken fence when she wasn't looking, left fresh water near her porch, and stood at a distance with his bow whenever coyotes howled too close. Sarah pretended not to notice, but she always did. One evening, as the sky bled orange across the desert, he lingered longer than usual. Dakota slept in Sarah's arms, his tiny fingers curled in her dress. The warrior stepped inside, shoulders heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. He knelt beside them, touching his son's small hand with reverence. His voice came low and uncertain. He told her, in the English he struggled with, that Dakota's mother had been killed during a raid against their band. He had carried the infant across miles of hostile land, hoping to find a safe place, but every door had closed in his face except hers. His tribe had scattered. His family was gone. He had nothing left but his son. Sarah listened, each word sinking deep into her bones. She saw the grief he had carved into silence, the fear he hid behind strength, the loneliness he lived with day after day. In his story, she recognized her own loss, her own nights of trembling, her own emptiness. The line between them grew thinner. She looked down at Dakota's sleeping face, warm against her chest. She realized that she didn't simply care for him, she needed him. He filled a space inside her she thought would remain hollow forever. And when she met the warrior's eyes, she saw the same truth reflected back at her. The world outside remained dangerous, full of men who hated his people and men who feared hers. But inside the small cabin, with the desert wind whispering around them, they had built something unspoken and fragile, a family bound not by blood but by choice, grief, and grace. The warrior reached out slowly, placing his hand over Sarah's. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tightened her fingers around his, steady and sure. In that moment, they understood that Dakota was not the only one who had been saved on that long, desperate night. They all had.